My name is Detective. David Morrison and I have been serving with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit for 16 years. In nearly 2 decades of investigating complex financial frauds and white-collar crimes, I have encountered every type of criminal imaginable. But sometimes, you meet someone whose story forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about family, abandonment, disability, discrimination, and the lasting psychological damage that rejection can inflict on a child. This is the story that Emily Harrison told me 11 months ago, sitting in her federal prison cell where she is serving 12 years for financial fraud, extortion, stalking, and criminal threats. When Emily first agreed to speak with me, I expected to hear another tale of greed and financial manipulation. Instead, I heard the methodical confession of a woman whose childhood abandonment had driven her to systematically destroy the father who had rejected her simply because she was born blind. Emily Harrison was 38 years old when she committed the crimes that would define the rest of her life. But to understand why Emily became a criminal, you have to understand the child she once was and the profound rejection she experienced from the moment she entered the world. Emily was born on a cold November morning in Seattle, Washington, to Richard Harrison and Maria Santos. The pregnancy had been normal, and both parents had been excited about welcoming their first child into the world. Richard was a successful commercial real estate developer who owned multiple properties throughout the Pacific Northwest. Maria was a talented pianist who taught music at a local community college. But when Emily was born, the doctors immediately noticed that something was wrong with her eyes. After extensive testing, they delivered devastating news to Richard and Maria. Emily had been born with a rare, congenital condition called Leber, congenital amaurosis, which caused severe vision impairment from birth. Emily would be legally blind for her entire life with only minimal light perception and no ability to see shapes, colors, or faces. Detective Morris and Emily said her voice filled with both pain and determination. My mother told me that my father left the hospital the day the doctors explained my condition. He walked out of that room and never came back to hold me or comfort my mother or even ask how we were doing. Richard Harrison's reaction to his daughter's blindness revealed the kind of person he truly was. Beneath his successful businessman exterior, he saw Emily's disability not as a challenge to overcome, but as an unacceptable flaw that made her worthless in his eyes. Within a week of Emily's birth, Richard filed for divorce and made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with raising a blind child. Maria was devastated by her husband's abandonment, but she refused to let Richard's rejection define their daughter's life. She fought for child support in the divorce proceedings, but Richard used his wealth and legal connections to minimize his financial obligations. The final settlement gave Maria barely enough money to cover basic living expenses, with nothing left over for the specialized education and therapy that Emily would need. Richard moved on with his life, immediately remarrying within a year to a woman named Jennifer who worked in his real estate office. He had 2 more children with Jennifer, both healthy and sighted, and created the perfect family that he had always wanted. He never attempted to contact Emily or Maria and made no effort to be part of his blind daughter's life in any way. Meanwhile, Maria devoted herself completely to raising Emily and giving her every opportunity to thrive despite her disability. Maria worked 2 jobs, teaching piano during the day and playing at restaurants and hotels in the evenings to earn enough money to pay for Emily's specialized education at the Washington State School for the Blind. Detective Morrison, Emily told me, tears streaming down her face, my mother sacrificed everything for me. She worked 16-hour days so I could have Braille textbooks and orientation training and music lessons. She never complained, never made me feel like I was a burden, even though I know how hard it was for her. Emily learned to read Braille by age 4 and showed exceptional intelligence and determination in her studies. But more importantly, Maria recognized that Emily had inherited her musical talent and began teaching her piano at a very young age. Emily had perfect pitch and an extraordinary ability to memorize complex musical pieces after hearing them just once or twice. Music became Emily's way of experiencing the world and expressing emotions that she could not convey through facial expressions or eye contact. By age 8, she was performing at local community events, and by age 12, she was winning regional piano competitions against sighted children who had every advantage that she lacked. But despite her achievements and her mother's unconditional love, Emily always felt the absence of her father like a wound that never healed. Maria tried to shield Emily from the truth about Richard's rejection, but eventually, Emily was old enough to understand that her father had abandoned her specifically because she was blind. I was 10 years old when I finally asked my mother why I didn't have a father like other children. Emily told me. She tried to sugarcoat it, but eventually she had to tell me the truth. My father left because he didn't want a blind daughter. He saw my disability as something shameful and unacceptable. That knowledge shaped Emily's entire worldview and created a burning desire to prove that she was not worthless or defective despite her blindness. She threw herself into her music, studies with obsessive determination, practicing piano for 6 to 8 hours every day and pushing herself to master increasingly difficult pieces. Emily attended the University of Washington on a full scholarship, majoring in music, performance, and composition. She graduated summa cum laude and went on to earn a master's degree in music therapy. By her mid-20s, Emily had established herself as a successful concert pianist and music therapist who worked with disabled children, teaching them to use music as a form of expression and healing. But even as Emily built a successful career and independent life, she could not let go of the anger and pain caused by her father's rejection. She thought about Richard, constantly wondering what kind of man could abandon his own child simply because she was born with a disability. Detective Morrison, Emily said, her voice taking on a harder edge. I spent years trying to understand how my father could walk away from me so easily. I built a successful life partly to prove to myself that I was worthy of love despite my blindness, but also because I wanted him to someday realize what he had given up when he abandoned me. When Emily was 32 years old, her mother, Maria, was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months to live, and there was nothing that could be done to stop the disease's progression. Maria faced her diagnosis with the same grace and strength that had characterized her entire life, but Emily was devastated by the impending loss of the only person who had ever truly loved her unconditionally. As Maria's condition deteriorated, Emily began researching her father for the first time in her life. She hired a private investigator to learn everything about Richard Harrison's current life, his business interests, his family, and his financial situation. What Emily discovered filled her with a rage that she had been suppressing for her entire life. Richard Harrison had become extremely successful, building a commercial real estate empire worth over $50 million. He lived in a mansion in Bellevue with his wife, Jennifer, and their 2 children, who were now adults pursuing their own successful careers. Richard had given his legitimate children every advantage that money could buy. They had attended the best private schools, taken exotic vacations around the world, and been provided with trust funds that ensured they would never have to worry about money. Richard was known in Seattle's business community as a devoted father who was deeply proud of his children's accomplishments. But Richard had never once attempted to contact Emily or even acknowledge her existence. He had paid the bare minimum in child support until Emily turned 18 and had never contributed a single dollar toward her education, therapy, or medical expenses beyond what the divorce decree legally required. Detective Morrison, Emily told me when I learned about the life my father had built while completely ignoring my existence, something inside me broke that could never be repaired. He had the resources to help me and my mother, but he chose to pretend we didn't exist because I wasn't the perfect daughter he wanted. Maria died 3 months after her diagnosis, with Emily holding her hand and playing her favorite piano piece as she took her last breath. At Maria's funeral, Emily stood alone beside her mother's grave while the few friends and colleagues who had known Maria paid their respects. Richard Harrison did not attend his ex-wife's funeral despite being informed of her death. He sent no flowers, no condolences, and no acknowledgement that the woman who had raised his daughter while he abandoned them had passed away. That final act of indifference was the catalyst that transformed Emily's pain and anger into something much more dangerous and calculating. She made a decision at her mother's graveside that would define the rest of her life. She was going to make Richard Harrison pay for every moment of abandonment. every dollar he had withheld and every tear that Maria had cried while raising their disabled daughter alone. Emily spent the next 6 months planning her revenge with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made her a successful musician. She used her inheritance from Maria, a modest amount of money saved over decades of hard work, to hire experts who could help her destroy her father's business empire. Detective Morrison, Emily said, her voice taking on the cold, calculated tone that characterized all of her planning. I wasn't going to physically hurt my father or his family. I was going to do something much more devastating. I was going to take away everything he valued most: his wealth, his reputation, and his perfect family image. Emily's plan was complex and multifaceted, requiring her to learn about financial fraud, corporate espionage, and identity theft. She studied these subjects with the same intensity she had once devoted to mastering Chopin and Rachmaninoff, determined to become as skilled at destruction as she had been at creation. The first phase of Emily's plan involved infiltrating her father's business network. She created a false identity as a financial consultant named Sarah Mitchell, who specialized in helping commercial real estate developers optimize their tax strategies and maximize profits. Emily used her musical connections to get introductions to people in Seattle's business community and eventually managed to get a meeting with Richard Harrison himself. She had practiced for months to ensure that she could interact with her father without him recognizing her voice or suspecting that the blind consultant sitting across from him was actually the daughter he had abandoned 38 years earlier. The meeting took place in Richard's downtown Seattle office, and Emily told me that it required every ounce of her emotional control to sit across from the man who had rejected her and speak calmly about business matters as if they were strangers. Detective Morrison, Emily said, I sat in my father's office, listening to him talk about his success and his pride in his children and his plans for expanding his business empire. He had no idea that the blind woman giving him financial advice was the daughter he had abandoned. To him, I was just another disabled person who happened to be good at numbers. Over the following months, Emily built a relationship with Richard based on her supposed financial expertise. She provided him with legitimate advice that helped him save money on taxes and structure his business dealings more efficiently. Richard came to trust Sarah Mitchell completely and began sharing confidential information about his financial holdings business, partners, and long-term strategic plans. This access was exactly what Emily needed to begin the next phase of her revenge plan. She used her position as Richard's trusted financial consultant to gradually gain access to his bank accounts, business records, and confidential financial documents. Emily told me that the hardest part of this phase was maintaining her professional demeanor while listening to Richard talk casually about his family. He would mention his son's graduation from law school or his daughter's successful career in medicine, and Emily would have to respond with polite interest while rage burned inside her at the reminder of everything she had been denied. But Emily remained patient and methodical because she understood that her revenge would only work if Richard never suspected that his trusted financial consultant was actually the daughter he had abandoned. She spent over a year building trust and gathering information before she began the actual criminal activity that would ultimately land her in federal prison. The destruction of Richard Harrison's business empire began with small, subtle acts of financial fraud that would not be immediately noticed. Emily created shell companies and fake investment opportunities that she used to siphon money out of Richard's accounts. She forged documents that made it appear as though Richard was making legitimate business investments when in reality the money was being transferred to offshore accounts that Emily controlled. Emily's blindness actually became an advantage in some ways because it made people underestimate her capabilities. Richard and his business associates assumed that a blind woman couldn't possibly be sophisticated enough to commit complex financial crimes, and this assumption allowed Emily to operate undetected for much longer than she otherwise might have. Over the course of 2 years, Emily stole over $8 million from Richard's various business accounts and investment funds, but the theft was structured in such a way that it appeared to be a series of bad business decisions and unfortunate market timing rather than deliberate fraud. Richard's business empire began to crumble as profitable deals fell through investments went bad, and partners backed out of agreements. Richard couldn't understand what was going wrong because he had always been successful in business and had trusted advisors who were supposed to protect him from these kinds of problems. What Richard didn't realize was that his most trusted financial consultant was systematically destroying everything he had built using his own confidential information against him and creating financial disasters that appeared to be natural business failures. As Richard Harrison's financial situation deteriorated, Emily moved to the next phase of her revenge plan, which was far more personal and psychologically devastating than simple theft. She wanted Richard to experience the same kind of abandonment and isolation that she had felt throughout her childhood. Emily began by systematically destroying Richard's relationships with his business partners and social connections. She used the confidential information she had gathered to create anonymous packages containing evidence of Richard's supposed financial mismanagement and questionable business practices. These packages were sent to Richard's major business partners, investors, and commercial real estate clients. The information was carefully curated to make Richard appear incompetent, greedy, and untrustworthy without directly implicating Emily in any criminal activity. Detective Morris and Emily told me with evident satisfaction. I wanted my father to feel what it was like to have people turn their backs on him, to have his support system disappear, to understand what abandonment actually feels like. The campaign was devastatingly effective. One by one, Richard's business partners began distancing themselves from him, citing concerns about his judgment and financial stability. Major clients moved their business to competing firms, and Richard found himself increasingly isolated in the business community that had once regarded him as a successful and respected figure. But Emily wasn't satisfied with just destroying her father's business empire. She wanted to destroy his personal life as well, to make him understand that actions have consequences and that abandoning a disabled child was not something that could be forgotten or forgiven. Emily's next target was Richard's marriage to Jennifer. Through her position as Sarah Mitchell, Emily had learned that Richard and Jennifer's relationship was not as perfect as it appeared from the outside. Like many couples who had been married for over 30 years, they had accumulated resentments and unspoken frustrations that could be exploited by someone who knew where to apply pressure. Emily created a fictional affair between Richard and a young employee at his company. She generated fake emails, text messages, and even doctored photographs that appeared to show Richard engaging in an inappropriate relationship. These materials were sent anonymously to Jennifer, along with a note suggesting that she investigate her husband's activities more carefully. Jennifer was devastated by the apparent evidence of Richard's infidelity and confronted him with the materials. Richard denied everything, but the evidence looked compelling, and Jennifer's trust in her husband was already shaken by his recent business failures and increasingly erratic behavior. The resulting conflict destroyed what remained of Richard and Jennifer's relationship. Jennifer filed for divorce and moved out of their mansion, taking their adult children with her and making it clear that she wanted nothing more to do with Richard. Detective Morrison, Emily said, I know it was wrong to destroy an innocent woman's marriage, but I couldn't feel sympathy for Jennifer. She had enjoyed 30 years of wealth and security that my mother never had. She had raised her children with every advantage while my mother worked too, jobs to provide for me. In my mind, she didn't deserve to be protected from the consequences of marrying a man who could abandon his disabled daughter. Emily's campaign of destruction continued with increasing boldness as she became more confident in her ability to manipulate situations without being detected. She forged legal documents that made it appear as though Richard had been engaging in tax fraud and sent copies to the IRS, triggering an extensive audit of his business and personal finances. She created fake complaints from former tenants of Richard's commercial properties, claiming that he had violated fair housing laws and discriminated against disabled renters. These complaints were filed with multiple government agencies and generated investigations that damaged Richard's reputation and tied up his remaining business resources in legal defense. Emily even targeted Richard's adult children using social media and anonymous communications to spread rumors about their father's business failures and supposed ethical violations. She wanted Richard to experience the complete collapse of his family relationships, to feel the same isolation and rejection that she had felt throughout her life. The most devastating phase of Emily's revenge began when she decided to reveal her true identity to her father. After 3 years of systematically destroying his life, she wanted Richard to understand exactly who had orchestrated his downfall and why. Emily arranged a meeting with Richard under the pretense of discussing a potential business opportunity that could help him recover from his financial difficulties. Richard was desperate for any lifeline and agreed to meet with Sarah Mitchell one more time despite his mounting suspicions about her role in his recent troubles. The meeting took place in Richard's nearly empty office. Most of his employees had been laid off, his properties had been foreclosed on, and he was facing multiple lawsuits and government investigations. Richard looked haggard and defeated, a far cry from the confident, successful businessman he had been just 3 years earlier. Detective Morris and Emily said this was the moment I had been planning for since my mother's funeral. I was finally going to make my father understand what he had done to me and my mother. Emily sat across from Richard and began speaking in a voice that she no longer disguised. She told Richard about her childhood, growing up without a father, about Maria's struggles to provide for her, about the specialized schools and therapy sessions that Richard had never contributed to. At first, Richard didn't understand what this blind consultant was telling him or why she was speaking so personally about matters that seemed irrelevant to their business relationship. But as Emily continued talking, Richard's confusion turned to recognition and then to horror as he realized who Sarah Mitchell really was. I am Emily Harrison, Emily said quietly. I am your daughter, the blind daughter you abandoned 38 years ago because you couldn't stand the thought of raising a disabled child. Richard sat frozen in his chair, staring at the blind woman across from him as the full implications of her revelation sank in. Emily told me that she could hear him breathing faster, his voice shaking as he tried to process what she was telling him. You, Emily, Richard stammered. You're Sarah Mitchell. You've been my financial consultant for 3 years. Yes, Emily replied calmly. I am Sarah Mitchell, and I am also your daughter, the daughter you walked away from at the hospital, the daughter you never called or visited or acknowledged, the daughter you erased from your life because I wasn't perfect enough for you. Emily then proceeded to explain in detail how she had systematically destroyed Richard's business empire, stolen millions of dollars from his accounts, and orchestrated the collapse of his marriage and social relationships. She wanted him to understand that every misfortune he had experienced over the past 3 years had been carefully planned and executed by the disabled daughter he had discarded. Detective Morrison, Emily told me I wanted to see my father's face when he realized that the person he had underestimated because of her disability had become powerful enough to destroy everything he cared about. I wanted him to understand that abandoning me was the biggest mistake of his life. Richard's initial shock quickly turned to rage as he processed what Emily had done. He threatened to call the police to have her arrested for fraud and theft. But Emily calmly explained that she had been careful to structure her crimes in ways that would be difficult to prove, and that any investigation would also reveal Richard's own financial improprieties and tax evasion schemes. More importantly, Emily told Richard that she didn't care if she was arrested or imprisoned. She had accomplished what she set out to do, which was to make him pay for abandoning her. The money she had stolen, the businesses she had destroyed, and the relationships she had ruined were all secondary to the satisfaction of seeing Richard understand that his disabled daughter was not weak or helpless or forgettable. Richard tried to appeal to Emily's emotions, asking for forgiveness and claiming that he had been young and scared when she was born and hadn't known how to handle having a disabled child. But Emily had no sympathy for his excuses. You weren't young and scared when I was 5 or 10 or 15, Emily said coldly. You weren't confused about how to be a father when I graduated from high school or college or graduate school. You had 38 years to reach out to me to apologize, to try to be part of my life. Instead, you pretended I didn't exist and built a new family that didn't include me. Richard then made what Emily considered his final unforgivable mistake. He tried to justify his abandonment by suggesting that Emily had turned out fine without him and that she should be grateful for the life her mother had provided rather than obsessing about his absence. That statement revealed that Richard still didn't understand the magnitude of his betrayal or feel genuine remorse for what he had done. Emily realized that her father was incapable of taking responsibility for his actions or acknowledging the pain he had caused. The meeting ended with Emily telling Richard that she had sent comprehensive documentation of her crimes to the FBI along with a full confession. She explained that she wanted to face consequences for her actions, but that she also wanted Richard to be investigated for his own financial crimes and to have the world know that he had abandoned his disabled daughter. Detective Morrison, Emily said, I knew that confessing would mean prison time, but I didn't care. I had accomplished what I set out to do, and I was ready to accept the consequences. More importantly, I wanted my story to be told publicly so that everyone would know what kind of man Richard Harrison really was. Emily's confession triggered a massive federal investigation into both her crimes and Richard's financial dealings. FBI agents spent months untangling the complex web of fraud, theft, and manipulation that Emily had created, discovering the full extent of her 3-year campaign of revenge. The investigation also revealed that Richard had indeed been engaging in his own financial crimes, including tax evasion, money laundering, and fraudulent business practices. While Emily was clearly guilty of more serious offenses, Richard's own criminal activity meant that he would also face prosecution. The case became a media sensation when details of Emily's background and motivation became public. Disability rights advocates praised her for exposing the discrimination and abandonment that disabled children often face, while legal experts debated whether her childhood trauma should be considered a mitigating factor in her sentencing. Richard's reputation was completely destroyed as the full story of his abandonment became public knowledge. His adult children, who had known nothing about their half-sister, were horrified to learn what their father had done, and many of his former friends and business associates publicly condemned his actions. Emily's trial lasted 6 weeks, and the emotional testimony about her childhood and her mother's struggles moved many observers to tears. Her defense attorneys argued that, while her crimes were serious, they had been motivated by profound psychological trauma caused by her father's rejection rather than simple greed or malice. But the prosecution successfully argued that Emily's crimes were too extensive and too carefully planned to be excused by childhood trauma. She had stolen $8 million, destroyed multiple businesses, and engaged in stalking, extortion, and identity theft over a period of 3 years. The systematic nature of her crimes and the fact that she had continued committing offenses long after achieving financial revenge demonstrated that she was dangerous and calculating, rather than simply traumatized. Emily was convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, extortion, stalking, and criminal threats. She was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 8 years. Richard Harrison was also convicted on charges of tax evasion and money laundering and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. His remaining assets were seized to pay back taxes and penalties, leaving him financially ruined and socially ostracized. Detective Morrison, Emily said, during our final interview, people ask me if I regret what I did to my father. The honest answer is no. He abandoned me because I was blind and spent 38 years pretending I didn't exist. He deserved to lose everything, just like he made my mother lose everything when he walked away from us. Emily paused, looking at the concrete walls of her prison cell. But I do regret that my actions hurt innocent people. Richard's wife didn't deserve to have her marriage destroyed, and his other children didn't deserve to learn about their father's cruelty in such a public way. I was so focused on making my father suffer that I didn't fully consider the collateral damage I was causing. Emily looked at me with the same determination that had driven her 3-year campaign of revenge. My father taught me an important lesson when he abandoned me, Detective Morrison. He taught me that disabled people are often treated as if they are worthless, as if their lives don't matter as much as the lives of people without disabilities. I spent my whole life trying to prove that I was just as valuable and capable as anyone else despite my blindness. Emily's voice grew quieter but more intense. When I destroyed my father's empire, I proved that even a blind woman could be more powerful and dangerous than a successful businessman with every advantage. I showed him and everyone else that underestimating disabled people is the biggest mistake you can make. As our interview concluded, I found myself grappling with questions that have no easy answers. Emily Harrison had committed serious crimes that hurt multiple innocent people and caused millions of dollars in financial damage. By any legal standard, she was a criminal who deserved punishment for her actions. But Emily's father had also committed a cruel and devastating act when he abandoned his infant daughter simply because she was born with a disability. His rejection had shaped Emily's entire life and created psychological wounds that had never healed. Despite her many achievements, Emily Harrison sits in federal prison today serving a 12-year sentence for crimes motivated by a lifetime of pain and abandonment. She spends her days teaching music to other inmates and writing compositions that she will never be able to perform in concert halls. Richard Harrison also sits in federal prison, serving his own sentence while his remaining family members try to distance themselves from the scandal that destroyed their reputation. His name has become synonymous with disability, discrimination, and parental abandonment. The case of Emily Harrison serves as a stark reminder that the way we treat disabled children has consequences that last for decades, and that abandonment can create wounds that never fully heal no matter how successful or accomplished a person becomes. Sometimes the children we reject grow up to become powerful adults who never forget the people who made them feel worthless. And sometimes that power becomes a weapon, used to settle scores that most people assumed had been forgotten. Emily Harrison was a brilliant musician who could have used her talents to create beauty and healing in the world. Instead, she used those same talents to orchestrate a symphony of destruction that brought down the father who had rejected her. If this story affected you, please subscribe to our channel for more true crime confessions that explore how childhood trauma and family rejection can shape adult behavior in unexpected ways. Next week, we will hear from a man who discovered his wife's devastating secret. Until then, remember that the children we abandon today may grow up to be the adults who seek justice tomorrow.